Okay, and we're broadcasting. I am Christopher Shulgan. I am one of the team here who creates content for Medcan, and today's webinar is the new normal. What does it look like at work? I'll provide brief bios for Dr. Peter Nord and Tracy Brower, our Ph.D. sociologist. And before we get to those, though, I want to talk a little bit about how to ask questions, because for the last 10 minutes of this webinar, we'll be taking questions after Tracy's presentation. So by now, most everyone knows there's a Q&A button on either the top of your screen, it may be at the bottom of your screen. And so you click that, and then I will flow questions to either Peter or Tracy as appropriate toward the end of our webinar. Tracy, how are you?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Peter, how are you?
Doing great, Chris. Thanks.
So this isn't the first time that the two of you have been on a webinar together, right? This is becoming, maybe this will become a regular thing. I think you guys work really well together. I am just going to bring on screen your bios. Okay, there. So Dr. Peter Nord is Medcan's Chief Medical Officer. Previously, Peter was a VP Chief Medical Officer at Unity Health Toronto, and your full bio is there. Peter, I won't go through the whole thing. And then Tracy is a PhD sociologist studying work life and the changing nature of work, workers, and workplace. She is the author of Bring Work to Life by Bringing Life to Work, a guide for leaders in organizations. She's at tracybrower.com. Okay, Peter, why don't you start things off with a bit of a pandemic update, and then we'll throw it to Tracy for her presentation after that.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so Tracy and I did co-present on a webinar a few weeks back, and I was just so impressed with the topic and the depth and experience that she brings as a sociologist, especially when the audience we might be more sort of business or medical, and we've been talking about epidemiology. And then it struck me that through our Safe at Work program, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about kind of the checklist, kind of the top 10 things that you need to think about as you start to think about what does life look like in the immediate future. Like, what does June look like? What does the next 6 months look like? And what does the next couple of years look like? And one of the first step really is to start to, rather than kind of worrying as much right now about June, what does your business look like 2 years from now? And then back into June. So rather than being reactive and not having a blueprint, I think we're recommending the benefit, and we're doing it here at Medcan too, like what does our business model look like 2 years from now? And how much at work, how much on site, what's the needs of our population, what's our value proposition? Are we gonna have to reevaluate that? What does our workforce look like? How can we better serve our clients and our customers, our patients? So I know we're dealing with it at Medcan, and many of our corporate clients, we're working with them. And so as we start to think about what each of our businesses is like a couple years down the road, and then having heard Tracy's presentation, it just sort of seemed very synergistic and she was good enough to give us time today to start to think about what does that look like, because that's the next phase, right? We're all thinking about how do we get back to the office? Are we staying at home? Childcare issues, schools opening, schools not opening, daycare, testing. What is the antibody test? We're going to be getting it in the next month or so here at Medcan. So what does that do to the whole return to work? How do we educate? How do we engage with our employees? How do we engage with our customers in a new way? How does that drive a communication strategy? But at the beginning of all that, it really is, what's a very clear vision for our business a couple of years from now, and really post-vaccine world as well? We hear, oh, everything's going to be great after the vaccine arrives. Well, no vaccine is 100%. Like on a good day, a vaccine 75, 80% effective. So we're going to be living, with this COVID virus in a very symbiotic relationship for the next little while. So it behooves all of us to start to think now, take a breath, take a bit of time, and start to do some future proofing. Look out over the horizon and see what does that look like. And that's why I was super excited that Tracy could join us today. So back to you, Chris.
Oh, that's great. Great, Peter. Well, Tracy, why don't we hand it over to you?
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction and kind background. Thanks to each of you and to Medcan for having me. I really appreciate it. So just pulling up the slides. Hopefully you can see them. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I think we are at such a tipping point as a society, and it's so interesting to think about when the paradigm shifts, everyone goes back to zero, everything changes. And this is going to be a center point in our lives, certainly. This is going to be one of those things that we look back on and say, oh, pre-COVID, and we may really look at life as being different post-COVID, but this will be a dividing point in our lives. So it's really interesting to start with a sense of how those paradigms are shifting and what that means for us. So there's an article we can send to you as a follow-up here that I have published, but really it's interesting to think about how our paradigms about safety and security have shifted. As business leaders, we're frequently thinking about how we create a sense of belonging, thinking about the Maslow hierarchy, how we make sure people feel valued, how we give them an opportunity for self-actualization. And as a matter of fact, people have been kind of bumped back down on that Maslow hierarchy down to physiological needs and basic needs for security. And so organizations that are able to produce that, deliver that, and even if that isn't their core competence, give a sense of that, will be really, really in better stead, because perception is as important as reality. Health is going to be critical. We all are living in that world today. I think it's also interesting to think about well-being and mental state. Organizations that support mental state as their core competence, organizations that are able to embrace it and expand programming. We'll talk about that in a minute. Another thing to think about is the impact on relationships. You know, like what are going to be the impacts on how we support people who may need additional counseling or marriage counseling after being together for so long in an isolated place. Demographers will tell us that if there's a baby boom, there'll be an interesting impact on businesses that follow the life cycle of that baby boom and that new generation. The experience of home is intensified. We're using more things at home, and therefore home goods are more necessary because of the higher utilization and consumption. In addition, people look around and they want to make their home even more of a nest. We're in much more of a paradigm of receive versus retrieve, and that has had some really interesting impacts on things like delivery services and online shopping and even food delivery. So there are lots of paradigms that are shifting. One of the critical paradigms is about density. Every business model at some level is based on density. How many people can I put into my concert hall? How many people can I pull into my sports stadium? How many people can I serve in my restaurant? And therefore, how are my cost structures driven by that? Even the office is based on cost structures and optimization of real estate. So all of those things will really create winners and losers. And a chief economist I talked to recently said, you know, those who adapt will win. And it's really going to be about adaptation. That's not news for us as business leaders, but it's probably more intense than ever. So this will also be one of the most significant reinventions of work in our experience. And so here's how we're thinking about some of those reinventions and how work will change. The other thing I think is really helpful as a construct is the idea that asking the right questions is actually more important than having all the right answers. You will have the right answers for your business, for your culture, for your business model, for your employees, but asking the right questions is critical. So let's ask some of those. One of the things that will be really interesting to watch is how companies change how they support people. One of those is around extended support. So we've seen this blossoming, this burgeoning of employee programs. There's, you know, Mindfulness Mondays and Yoga with Christine on Tuesdays and, you know, Wellbeing Wednesdays and financial training and training on how to exercise at home. We hear about Silicon Valley companies or any company that provides meals for employees, giving employees information about nutrition. So programs have been expanded significantly, and we expect that kind of expansion to continue. The other thing we know is that mental health has been significantly impacted through the pandemic. 75% of people, according to one study, are experiencing social isolation. The longer people work from home, the more they experience stress, anxiety, wandering thoughts, difficulty focusing. So we know that mental health may be increasingly something that companies need to pay attention to and intentionally support. The other thing that's really interesting to think about as business leaders is the idea of leadership. There just isn't room for mediocrity in leadership during cataclysmic times. You know, it's like the water level. When the water level goes down, we can see more of the rocks in the river or the rocks in the pond. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing from leaders. The best leaders have always been the ones who can give you a sense of purpose, who can manage by objectives and outcomes rather than by presence, who can motivate people even in the face of ambiguity. And this is one of those times when great leadership is going to rise. We're going to feel that power of that leadership. We're going to recognize, and that kind of leadership is going to become a model. At the same time, we may see a weeding out of leaders who are less effective, and we may need to see that weeding out because, again, that mediocrity can't necessarily be as supportive as it needs to be during these times. The other thing I would suggest that is going to be critical for us is the idea of culture. I just published an article last night about the power of culture and the idea that if culture is how things get done around here or what people do when no one's looking, culture is doing harder work than ever right now. When we send everybody home and we don't have the same physical proximity to leaders and teammates in the office, culture becomes true north. It becomes context. It becomes absolutely the way that people make decisions. And so when we manage culture really intentionally, we end up being much more successful as businesses. And so that constructive, productive culture is a really big deal in terms of our future. So the question for you, if the questions are more important than the answers so that you can have the right answers for your business, the key question is, how will you create a sense of safety and security for employees going forward? And this is about, as we said, perception as much as reality. It's really interesting. I saw a great quote that was something like, the way people define safety and security going forward is going to be through the smell of Clorox, right? Like, you may have always provided employees with a safe and a clean work environment, but all of a sudden perception is going to be reality. How much people feel that they're safe and clean because they see cleaning crews or they smell cleanliness, how much they feel supported through the culture, through leadership, through programming that is supportive to them. So those are some of the things that we want to raise to a level of explicitness in terms of how we're supporting. The other thing that's really interesting to think about in terms of the future of work is how people work together. Sociologically speaking, one of the primary ways that we bond with other people is through a common enemy phenomenon. When we're faced with danger, when we're faced with threat, when we're faced with ambiguity, when we go through really hard times, that creates a bond socially. And we will come out on the other side of this with that bond together. So whether we're talking about pre-vaccine or post-vaccine, the way people work together may actually be enhanced. We've established a level of intimacy together. We've, heard our kids in the background or heard our dogs barking in the background or, been together with our baseball caps on, which isn't typically how we show up in an office or a workplace or a healthcare facility. And so that gives us a sense of intimacy, togetherness, and social proximity. The other thing that's really interesting to consider is diversity. In the typical office environment, it can be hard for people to get around who are challenged in terms of their mobility. It can be sometimes hard to hear in a traditional meeting or hard to see the whiteboard from a distance. But at home, we can tap the untapped potential that we may not have been tapping before. People can turn up the resolutions on their screens or turn up the volume and not be challenged with mobility. So it's interesting to think about how you might level the playing field in terms of how you tap resources. The other thing that's super interesting is work life. When I was doing some of my research for my Ph.D., I looked for senior executives who had children under the age of 16 who were juggling and navigating and really working through the work-life boundaries. It was hard to find those people. Because a lot of times people at the top of organizations aren't necessarily dealing with some of the challenges of home and work and some of the boundaries, but all of a sudden we're all home dealing with distractions and some of the wonderful and challenging things that happen in the home environment. So we may actually see greater empathy for work life because we've all been in this challenge in terms of the boundaries. So the question is, how will the ways that people work with others shift in the new normal? How might we start with process and figure out what are the critical things that we need to do in the office or not in the office? How might we start with new kinds of relationships where we really have a new level of empathy for each other? Those are the opportunities and some of the potentials for the work that we'll do in the future. The other thing I love to think about is the idea of innovation. The greatest innovation arise from the greatest barriers. If we don't have a lot of barriers around us, we're not forced to think differently. When we're absolutely constrained by new barriers and new limitations and new challenges, and really those are what are going to require newest kinds of thinking. So you have an opportunity to think about your company's systems and approaches. It's really interesting. If we look at the growth cycle of organizations, we start in the garage, right? Figuratively speaking, and usually literally speaking. We kind of roll up our sleeves and we figure things out, and we don't have all the right answers, and we make a lot of mistakes. And then we get to a point that things are starting to work. We're humming along, and we create systems for consistency and continuity and really predictability over time. And we call that bureaucracy. Those are policies and practices that help us move things along in a consistent manner. Sometimes, though, bureaucracies can get in the way. And what the pandemic has done is it's decimated some of those policies and practices. And we've had to respond really, really quickly. Organizations that had to send laptops to thousands of people over the course of a couple of days to get up to speed and get everybody home and get everybody working. Decisions that had to be made to switch manufacturing lines or switch the way we deliver healthcare or switch the way we support employees. All of those things had to happen quickly. That gives us a new sense of how we might be faster and how we might make different decisions in the future. In addition, innovation can flourish. Like, we might think about things in a really different way, given a really different reality that we're facing. The other interesting thing to think about is just collaboration between companies. Companies who are not necessarily antitrust oriented or sharing their deepest, darkest IP secrets, but companies that are collaborating to deliver needs to the community, to share ideas for, face mask patterns or chemistry for creating new levels of hand sanitizer in distilleries. Companies that are sharing in ways that they might not have given that they were traditionally competitors. And so the opportunity is to think differently about the business and about the systems and the systemic nature of our businesses. So the question for you, in what ways will your company's approaches shift in the future? Couple more things. The other thing that's interesting is career opportunities. I know it seems really counterintuitive when there are so many people furloughed, when unemployment is really high, when we're not sure when we'll all be able to get back to work or whether we'll get back to work in the same ways. But in reality, those are opportunities for some of the best career growth. The traditional swim lanes, the traditional responsibilities that we assign people are really, really shattered, and sometimes in a good way. That can give you the opportunity to tap new potential in people. People can stretch in new ways. People might be really motivated to take risks that they wouldn't have taken in the past. And that can tap into new, really talents and skills in the organization. The other thing to think about is that as we return to normal or to something different, every company is a startup company to some extent. Every organization is starting to do new things or turning back on or turning up or accelerating. And so that's going to put us in a place where we want to tap the best entrepreneurial spirit, people who can invent, who can figure things out, who can solve problems, who have lots of energy and motivation. Those are the people you're going to tap in your organizations. So the question is, in what ways will you empower people to contribute in expanded ways? And then last one, workplace and technology are surely shifting. So we expect increased work flexibility. We've sent everybody home, and a lot of organizations who believed that work couldn't get done from home have had that barrier really shifted. They've really said to themselves, wow, this is working pretty well, even under the circumstances that aren't the best, with distractions at home that you might not even regularly have in the new normal. And so lots of companies are saying, we're not necessarily going to return everybody to work in the way that we used to work before, and we expect to provide a greater expansion of the continuum in terms of where people are working, how they're working, and when they're working. The other thing that's pretty cool to think about is better offices. One of the things that has been required in going home is being away from the workplace, whatever your workplace is, whether it's an office or a field location or healthcare or manufacturing. And people tend to not anymore take for granted the office or the workplace. And so the anticipation is that this may give us a new impetus to create better places to work, because we realize and recognize all the values of those workplaces, all that we love about the workplace. Working from home is wonderful, and it's a both and to work in an office, in a workplace, in a field location, in a healthcare facility. And finally, comfort with technology. If we weren't comfortable before, we sure are now. So the question is, in what ways will you need to shift the way that you accommodate work and the way that you accommodate technology going forward? Lots of resources and reading that are available to you that we can send out, as a follow-up. And I think the real potential is for our reinvention, our reimagination. The worst thing would be for us to take this crisis and to not use it. It was, I think, Winston Churchill who said, never waste a good crisis. So we have this wonderful opportunity to reinvent, reimagine, and influence. And as business leaders, you're in a wonderful position to do that. It's not all rosy. It's not all Pollyanna. It's hard stuff. It's really difficult, the challenges that we're going through. But by goodness, we can really, really come out on the other side with some new thinking. And that's always a good thing. So thank you. I'll turn it back to you, Chris and Peter.
Thanks a lot, Tracy. That was great. I really enjoyed. Gosh, the post-density world is. I think that's a fascinating thing to think about. And boy, yeah, you've given us a lot to think about. Peter, do you have any? I'll move on to questions in a minute. But did you have anything that you wanted to sum up or anything like that?
No, let's just take the time and answer any questions that might be burning the last few minutes.
So the first question that I think we'll touch on is about culture, which you made reference to in your presentation. And if I think about the things that created the best culture for the companies that I've worked with in the past, they've all been things like, once was a mud run or a scavenger hunt, and it all ended up with like human bodies sort of in close proximity, bouncing around. You think about those mud runs, the germs in those, but how, and you talked about the intentionality that's necessary to create a strong work culture. So in future, in this post-pandemic world, how do companies create strong cultures in a world where everybody or a lot of people are working from home?
Yeah, it's such an important question. I actually just published an article about this last night, which we can share with the group, but I think it's partly about purpose. Like, how do we give people a really great sense of purpose and alignment between what they're doing and how that relates to that overall purpose? That is more important than ever, because we're not getting that kind of automatic sense of purpose by being together. That's one. I think another way to really help to create a strong culture and sustain a strong culture is through information density and the density of and fabric of our relationships with each other. Information density is about more people having more information more immediately, so we can all make good decisions. And so creating that sense of information density. And then also the fabric of the connections, the density of our network. We want people to feel a sense of reciprocity, a sense of alignment between their work and other people's work, a sense of responsibility to team members, and a sense of real mutual connection. So we can grow so much in our relationships through those mud runs, Chris, And we really, really create that sense of connection through tasks. When we work on tasks together, that's a really strong way to build a culture. So those are some of the ways: purpose, information density, the fabric of the relationships, and the social weave of our organizations are critical to culture.
Those, those shared, when you're talking to somebody at 10 p.m. on a Saturday or Saturday night to meet some deadline on a Monday morning, these are shared experiences as, dogs and kids are running around in the background. So I guess, that can create a strong culture too. But one interesting thing that I thought was a thread that went through your presentation was the importance and the value of the office. That we are expanding the continuum of how to work, but we're also missing something, I think, if we just completely permanently move away from this office. And people are, Shopify, a Canadian company, just talked about how they anticipate maybe never returning to the office. Facebook talked about 50% working from home. So can you talk about the value of the office a little bit?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Any company is smart to think about this. We invest billions in real estate, and people can be productive from home, but it would be a travesty if the office goes away entirely. As a sociologist, we know that our humanity depends on face-to-face relationships, in proximity, in human connection with each other. And we can get some of that virtually, but not all of it. So we need the office for those human connections. We need the office for our mental well-being. Like, it gives us an opportunity to be more concrete in our memory, gives us an opportunity to move across a campus, which is good for us. It's also really good from the standpoint of variety. Our brains we know from neuroscience that our brains demand some more variety. It also actually gives us a boundary from home. We used to talk about work staying away so we could really focus on our home life. And now people are saying, I'd love a little break to get into the office. And so the office brings us so many benefits at a human level, at kind of a brain neuroscience level, at a physical level, and in terms of growing our network. It just gives us that connection to other people that we can't get any other way. We can partially get it virtually, absolutely, but we can't do everything from home. And just because we can doesn't mean we should. So the office shouldn't go away. It has real value to bring us.
That's fantastic. I think there's room for one more question, which I think involves travel, is the one that we'll talk about. And Peter, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. The problem of borders, so Canada, we have our rates here, and our pandemic has happened one way here, and then in the United States, it's another situation. UK, same, different situation as well. So when travel comes back, obviously companies are going to try to socially distance and shelter at home as much as possible. But when travel comes back, how do you foresee companies, not governments, but companies themselves managing, the chief marketing officer who had to go to Manhattan for meetings with advertisers or something like that? What are those policies? What are the best practices you're hearing?
Yeah, I think what we're hearing is it's very almost sector specific. There are some things that a lot of our leaders are thinking they actually just need to be in the room. Like they need to physically be there, both from being there for their employees and just having that face time and not virtual, but actual face time. And also for establishing partnerships, mergers and acquisitions. Tough to do all of that virtually. And there's some things that you just can't do virtually very well. So that will beg the question about travel. And I think what we're going to end up is having this long-term, as I said, sort of symbiotic relationship with this virus, which means that travel will never be the same. We're going to figure out that we can actually do quite a bit virtually. The percentage of the previous travel budget is going to go significantly down, for sure in the short term, because it's the burden of travel right now is so high that most organizations are saying, we're just going to, again, shelter in place inside our borders. Eventually, that'll start to open up a little bit more, but for the next foreseeable future, for the next couple of years, we can anticipate that, traveling across the border is still going to require a 14-day quarantine with sometimes very draconian measures to control your access until everybody knows for sure that you are, COVID-free and that you're not going to pose a risk for that particular population. We've seen that causing the second wave, third wave, fourth wave. And so it's a real concern. It's a valid concern. So not that travel is not going to be there. It definitely will be. But organizations are going to have to deal with the burden of travel and weigh that against the benefit of travel as we march over the next few months and few years, for sure.
Fantastic. Thanks for that. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to, so Medcan's Safe at Work system, we're providing our services to some of Canada's and the world's biggest companies. And I want to show how to learn more about the Safe at Work system, which this is. I'm sharing my screen, and this is medcan.com. You can just go down and learn about CMO in a box and nursing support and education and consulting services all the way through there. If you want to learn more specifically about how to hire Medcan for the Safe at Work system, then go to or email corporate sales at medcan.com. I'm going to talk about our Safe at Work seminars here. So now I'm going to, okay, so upcoming. So next Tuesday, we have a seminar that is explicitly about testing. Lots of movement happening there, a path to COVID-19 clarity. So that'll be an explainer, PCR tests, serological surveys, antibody tests, point of care screening. What does all of this stuff mean? Which tests are most appropriate to what settings? Lots of questions and lots of direction, lots of guidance. The next one, Tuesday, June 9, is on tracing, the challenge of containing future outbreaks, and that's contact tracing and the containment strategies that involve minimizing risk and minimizing risk of outbreaks themselves. So now I'm gonna, so Tracy, thanks very much. That was fascinating. Oh, the other thing is that we do archive these webinars on Medcan's YouTube channel. So I will send out an email that provides the link to the YouTube channel. In that, Tracy, will you also send me some of your most recent articles? You made reference to numerous articles. So if you could pass those on, I'll put them in the email to everybody who registered for the webinar. And then if anybody wants to pass on the YouTube video, they can do that as well. Thanks so much, Tracy, and thanks so much, Peter. Any final thoughts, summing up thoughts, anything like that?
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. We'll get through this. It'll be exciting on the other side.
Peter, what about you?
Yeah, just stay safe and be patient.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks everyone for the great questions, and stay safe. Goodbye.